Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Hail State Debate. It is September/October of 2023, and we are looking at the Lincoln-Douglas resolution resolved. The United States ought to guarantee the right to housing. As always on the channel, we want to make sure it's useful to you, so the links to the sources that we cite and the timestamps will be in the description below. So will links to our team's social media if you just kind of want to keep up with what we're getting up to here at Mississippi State. If it is useful to you, maybe like, maybe subscribe, maybe tell a friend. And with that, we will very efficiently jump right in. We're going to do a shorter video this time. We're going to use a technique I've used before in the past, which is a sort of a top 10 tips video as opposed to a comprehensive sort of cover everything type of video. And as you probably noticed, the video is a little bit late this time. And that's for two reasons. One, we had a brand new novice Lincoln-Douglas topic that we had to make a video on and get out pretty quickly. And then secondly, we had just this huge PF topic on the Arctic, which just took up a lot of our time. So we got a little delayed, but I still had a lot of what I thought were pretty good ideas on the housing topic, and I wanted to get them out there. Plus, you know, a lot of the tournaments in September, October come later on in September or in October. So there's still, I think, plenty of time for folks to keep working on their cases. So I thought it was worth putting them out there. So let's do some initial thoughts, and then we'll jump into sort of the top 10 tips that I thought of in researching and helping folks research on the housing topic. So in terms of initial thoughts, just very briefly, you know, I love the topic area. I think it's really interesting, but I don't love the balance. I think intuitively, it's just really hard for the negative on this topic to argue that the problems facing homeless people, as well as the problems facing like working families who are getting priced out of the housing market in some parts of the country, don't warrant a pretty aggressive solution. Negatives, I think, run a really big risk by sort of engaging directly with the core philosophical question here, which is whether the state should create this affirmative entitlement for everyone to have housing. You know, there are some old school, hardcore libertarian arguments that the state shouldn't do that, but the vast majority of folks in the United States have implicitly rejected the idea that the government should just on principle not provide for people's needs. Even most conservatives accept that the government needs to ensure that certain needs are met, like food, education, and in most rich countries, healthcare. So if we've sort of already agreed that there is some kind of basic right to have those needs met, that the government needs to be in the business of helping people meet those needs, it's a pretty hard sell, I think, for the negative to argue that something as basic as housing, just having a roof over your head so you don't have to sleep in the street, is fundamentally less important, or that it's some kind of luxury. And yes, the negative can definitely argue about like the practical difficulty of providing housing to everyone. That's certainly a valid argument. But that actually points to another problem with the resolution that kind of skews the balance, which is that it's extremely vague. Right? There's no universally or generally accepted definition of what a right to housing entails on a practical level. There's no clear definition of what it means for a country to guarantee that right. It's not like a legal term of art that has a specific meaning in a statute or something somewhere. So that gives the Aff a lot of room to be, frankly, very slippery and avoid committing to a specific plan, which would at least give the negative some concrete like cost-benefit analysis and some trade-offs to attack. So basically, I think that while it's a really interesting topic, really timely topic, I think the negative is going to have to be very strategic here about like locking the Aff into something more specific than, you know, it would be good if people had houses. And that's going to be a real challenge. And it's a shame because other than that, I think it's a great topic. But it is certainly not impossible. There are some solid options. You just have to be on your toes as you prep your cases and your blocks on the neg to bring this back to something resembling a level playing field. So with that, let's waste no time and jump into our top 10 tips on the September-October 2023 topic on the right to housing. Okay, so let's get started with tip number one, and some of these I've phrased as questions, and you'll see why I do that in just a second. But number one on our list is, what does the term guarantee mean? Let me start by explaining why I think this is deceptively important. So guarantee is kind of an unusual term for a debate resolution. Usually when resolutions talk about rights, they use verbs like recognize or maybe establish. Policy type resolutions might use somewhat more concrete terms like enforce or enact or something similar to that, but guarantee is kind of atypical. And I think there are at least a couple of ways it could be interpreted to really potentially skew the debate, one for the Aff and one for the neg. So I wanted to get you ready in case you hear them and give you what I think is a somewhat better interpretation of the word guarantee. So the word guarantee is both a noun and a verb. So let's look at the verb definitions, and they include Webster, which says to engage for the existence, permanence, or nature of, to undertake to do or secure, to give security to. Cambridge says to promise that something will happen or exist. Collins says to promise that something will definitely happen or that you will do or provide for it. So in a nutshell, a guarantee is a promise, which means if we want to speak in very practical terms, when you vote AF on this resolution, the United States, presumably the United States federal government, but that is of course debatable, is going to be making some kind of a promise that a right to housing will exist. So having established that, what are the potential ways that this definition could be skewed? Well, first, AF could argue that the word guarantee basically allows for the judge to kind of fiat solvency. This argument looks at the word guarantee using another definition, like, for example, this one from Webster, which says that guarantee is an assurance for the fulfillment of a condition. This definition treats a guarantee as an assurance, which has led some folks that I've seen to argue that means when you vote for the AF, you're essentially ensuring that the right to housing is somehow meaningfully enforced or realized. That would allow the AF to kind of skip past having to advocate for any kind of plan, to sort of dodge negative arguments about how maybe universal housing is implausible or even impossible. And these ideas are important because, as we'll talk about later, there are all sorts of rights that get asserted or even guaranteed in some cases that just don't come to fruition. Like, for example, the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights is full of unenforced rights. But in this case, I think it's the wrong interpretation of the verb guarantee, mainly because making a guarantee or an assurance or whatever synonym you want to use doesn't mean that it's a valid guarantee or a plausible guarantee or something that you can take for granted. I could guarantee you that you'll win every single round on this topic, but that is a meaningless statement unless you have the skill to do it and a good plan for doing it. So you can't simply assume that because we use the word guarantee that whatever we're talking about is going to come to fruition. It's just a promise. It could be an empty promise. So I think if you run into AF debaters who try to skip past the practical questions of how a right to housing would work or how it would be feasible, and they're saying, well, guarantee means it's a certainty, you can fiat that. The answer is no. People make invalid, unsupported guarantees all the time. Governments even do it. We have, as I said before, guaranteed rights that don't come to fruition. And if they can't explain how the right will work and how it will be enforced, I think that's a valid critique on the neg. Now, on the other side of the coin, some neg debaters might try to turn the definition of guarantee around and try to say that it basically means that AF has to give a specific plan or a specific advocacy that as a practical matter will assure housing for everybody. And we're going to look at this as an option for the neg later in the video. The basic argument would be if AF doesn't give you a concrete, clear picture of how this housing is going to actually be provided, how it's going to be assured, they really haven't given you a guarantee, Judge, so they're not topical. In other words, at the end of the round, if you don't have a very clear picture of exactly how this housing is going to be provided, that's not a guarantee. At least it's not a meaningful guarantee, so you can vote negative. I don't think this is an obviously wrong interpretation. As we'll discuss later, there are definitions of guarantee that imply that a certain degree of certainty is necessary. And this is definitely something that requires some selling, but if you can win this idea that a guarantee requires a plausible plan for realizing the goal, that does open up a lot of new ground for the negative to attack the AF, both on topicality as well as to attack the negative impacts of making empty promises and why making empty promises, even if it is topical, is still bad. But right now, let's move on to point number 2. What exactly does the right to housing mean? So, okay, we've established that a guarantee is some kind of promise, whether it's kept or not, whether it's enforced or not. What precisely are we promising? Well, here again, this may be an area where the negative tries to load the AF up with some pretty extreme demands, especially since unlike established rights, like say free speech, the right to bear arms, even healthcare, there's no single consensus understanding of what a right to housing means in practical terms. Different authors present radically different conceptions of what it is. So a right to housing could be anything from a nationwide multi-trillion-dollar program to literally build public housing everywhere, to something like a much more modest policy of rent controls or eviction protections or something like that. So the question is, what exactly on the AF are we promising? I would say that the single most influential source on this is probably the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, which outlines what it considers to be the essential elements of a right to housing. This is an especially relevant source because the resolution says the right to housing using the definite article, in other words, the word the, to imply that there is a single agreed upon right as opposed to like a slate of options that you can pick from. And as the negative, if you have an AF that's running like maybe sort of a made up, like homemade version of the right to housing, that's something they just kind of cooked up for their case, and you wanted to be pretty aggressive about it, you might argue that the definite article the before the term right to housing means that the AF has to advocate for like some common consensus version, the right, as opposed to a right. And certainly the UN definition, if there was going to be a the definition, would probably be the one that you would pick because it's extremely influential and cited by a lot of different folks in a lot of different contexts. So what does the UN definition say? Well, it's pretty long, so let's get started. Adequate housing must provide more than 4 walls and a roof. A number of conditions must be met before particular forms of shelter can constitute adequate housing. These elements are just as fundamental as basic supply and availability. For housing to be adequate, it has to meet these criteria. So first of all, it says security of tenure. So there has to be protections against being evicted or arbitrarily kicked out without presumably some due process. You can't be harassed, you can't be threatened about eviction and things along those lines. You have to have availability of services, materials, facilities, and infrastructure. So things like drinking water, adequate sanitation, energy for cooking, things like that. In less developed countries, those might be sort of a big ask. They might be a lot to demand. In the United States, it's not such a big deal. That's pretty standard for most housing. Affordability. So if housing is not adequate, if it compromises the enjoyment of other rights, in other words, if it's too expensive. This one is important because, as we'll talk about in just a minute, the term affordability means that the right doesn't have to be free. You don't have to get housing for free. It just has to be housing that's not excessive in cost. And we'll talk about what that means in practical terms in a minute. And then you have habitability. It has to be physically safe. It has to keep out the cold, things like that. Accessibility. So it has to meet the needs of disadvantaged or marginalized groups. Here again, access, for example, for the disabled might fall under this, and that could be a big ask in some less developed countries. In the United States, under laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act, that's basically pretty standard. Another point that they treat as a prerequisite is location. It says housing is not adequate if it's cut off from employment opportunities, healthcare services, schools, childcare centers, and so on. This one's really interesting because it's not clear what it means to be cut off from employment or schools or services. And we'll come back to this in a second. But it's one really interesting wrinkle in what it means to have housing. Like, where does the housing have to be? How close does it have to be to like services and things like that? And then lastly, this really interesting one of cultural adequacy. Housing is not adequate if it does not respect and take into account the expression of cultural identity. I'm not really sure exactly what this means, but I have to assume it refers to like not forcing people into living situations that are maybe incompatible with their cultural or religious beliefs. So for example, maybe housing that forces unmarried women to live with men might be unacceptable for people of certain religious faiths. So maybe you'd have to have an alternative to that. Anyway, as you can see, this is a long slate of requirements. As the UN website says, it's clearly not just 4 walls and a roof. Now, as we hinted at for the neg, there are a lot of elements in here that are far more demanding than just the general idea that nobody should be homeless. And if you can get the judge to agree that the right to housing is basically defined by this document and demands all of these things on this long list, there's a lot more potentially for the negative to attack. So, for example, what does security of tenure mean? Well, if it means you can't be arbitrarily evicted if you pay the rent, that seems pretty common sense and fair. But what if you don't pay the rent? What if you can't? What if you lost your job? Well, if security of tenure means you can't be evicted in that case, that's going to create some major problems. If developers and landlords can't evict people who aren't paying the rent for whatever reason, that's going to really affect incentives to build housing in the future. Why would a developer build a new housing development if they know that one day when many of the renters can't afford the rent, they can't do anything about it. They can't collect it or kick them out. And this is an argument raised by Steve Greenhunt in Reason magazine in 2023 in a piece critiquing California's proposed Constitutional Amendment 10, which would establish a statewide right to housing and closely tracks the UN's language on what that would entail. And what it says is, Proposed California Constitutional Amendment 10 also defines the right to housing as a right to protection from forced evictions and so on. That means housing with security of tenure. That offers cultural adequacy. And he talks about how we don't really know what cultural adequacy means, but we do have some idea of what protection from forced evictions and security of tenure means. It means it's a lot harder to evict people. And then he goes on to say if a property owner can't properly vet tenants and potentially evict them, then they aren't going to invest in or rent out apartments. They certainly aren't going to make repairs to houses lived in by non-paying tenants, which makes the housing stock less adequate. We need more housing, not less, and such edicts discourage housing investment. So I think the takeaway here is, if I'm the negative, I'd really like to lock the Aff into a broad, expansive definition of the right to housing. And if I can get negative to, for example, agree to the UN definition or something similar to that in cross-examination, that would be fantastic because it's a much, much more demanding claim than just saying, hey, people should generally have some kind of housing. I don't think most Aff debaters are going to allow that. Instead, I think the Aff might look to something like this. This is a potential amendment to the Irish Constitution proposed by Irish law professor David Kenny and published in District Magazine in 2022. And as you can see here, the proposed amendment just says the state acknowledges that everyone has a right to access to appropriate, affordable, and secure housing. In Section 2, it says the state shall take reasonable legislative and other measures within its available resources to realize the right. And then it talks a little bit about some eviction protections and things along those lines. So as you can see, this is a lot simpler and a lot more restrained. You add a right to housing to, say, the Constitution, or maybe you write it as a statute, and you say that you're going to take reasonable steps over time to progressively implement it. And you set up some basic immediate protections on things like arbitrary evictions. This gives the Aff a lot of flexibility. It gives them a long time horizon, but it also puts some immediate tangible protections in place. So I actually think the Kenny proposal in Ireland is a really good model for the Aff. Whether you read it in your case as a plan or an advocacy, or maybe just have it in your block files if you need to answer a question about exactly how the right to housing would work, I do think it strikes a really good balance of being concrete without like over-promising stuff that you can't deliver. And while we're on the subject of what a right to housing is, let's take a second to answer some of the common questions about it. So one common question is, first, does a right to housing mean housing has to be free? Now, we've mentioned this just a second ago, but I would say the answer to this is definitely not. Both the UN and the Kenny definitions use the term affordable to describe the right to housing, which very strongly implies that individuals are expected to pay something for it, even if it's not the full market value. So what would affordable housing look like? Well, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development defines affordable housing this way. It says affordable housing is generally defined as housing on which the occupant is paying no more than 30% of gross income for housing costs, including utilities. And we'll drop a link to that. This, again, is a nice source to have for the Aff to give some concreteness to what like affordable housing looks like in the real world. It's a nice definition because by using a percentage rather than a number, it scales up and down to income. This is a nice source to have for the Aff to give some concreteness to what affordable housing looks like in the real world. In particular, it's a nice definition because by using a percentage as opposed to a number, it can scale up and down to people's income. Last question I have on this is, where exactly are you guaranteed housing? And I think this is important because for many people, housing prices in large cities where like jobs and opportunities are the real barrier. It's not like a nationwide shortage of housing everywhere. It's a shortage of affordable housing in certain key places where the opportunities are. In fact, you could argue that the housing crisis is really much more of a crisis in large, expensive cities where working people struggle to find housing that they can afford. So if you're living in Greenwood, Mississippi, I can tell you that you're definitely going to easily find a decent apartment or maybe even a small house for less than $1,000 a month or somewhere in that range. Whereas if you live in a place like San Francisco, your average rent is going to be more than $3,500 a month, according to multiple sources. So the question here is, in the Aff world, say I have a family of 5 and I need a 3 to 4 bedroom house or apartment, and say I'd like to live in a place like, say, Palo Alto or Menlo Park in the Bay Area, where home prices are an average of $2 million. Maybe my job is in that area. Maybe that's where I work. Do I have a right to demand a house or housing exactly where I want it in that really expensive neighborhood because maybe that's where I work? In other words, does the right to housing mean the right to housing precisely where I want it or very, very close to where I want it? Or at the other end of the spectrum, does the right to housing just mean the right to be housed somewhere in America? So in other words, in that version, you could say, well, we'll give you a house, but you're going to have to move to like Greenwood, Mississippi for it. And I think most people would agree it's probably somewhere in between those two extremes. Probably something like a right to housing somewhere in like whatever metropolitan area you choose, but not necessarily the specific neighborhood you prefer. I don't have a source on that, so if you find one, that might be interesting. I think that's a common sense answer, but most people I think would say a right to housing is a right to be housed somewhere in the city, somewhere in the surrounding counties, something like that, but not necessarily in exactly the place you want to live. But I think at the end of the day, the bottom line is the Aff should just be ready to say that there are many different permutations of how a right to housing can work, and that common sense basically has to prevail, and that they don't have to spell out every single last detail of how it would work, as long as there is a basic outline of how a right to housing works in general. So that leads to point number 3. Does the word ought change the Aff's burden? Now briefly, let me address another kind of sort of squirrely argument that sometimes gets made on these really broad quasi-policy resolutions, and namely it's the idea that the word ought converts the debate into a purely abstract moral discussion, and that it somehow allows the Aff to get out of having to talk about implementation or solvency or the practical problems of the resolution. Briefly, I've never thought this was correct, and I don't think it's correct in this resolution. We've said before on this channel, but let me quickly offer my thoughts on this issue. Some people like to cite dictionary definitions of the word ought that include this notion that ought is a moral question. It implies a moral question. It asks whether something is morally right. And from that, what they do is they extrapolate that if a debate is about moral issues, that somehow eliminates the need to talk about like practical obstacles, implementation, or solvency. I have never seen a good justification for that second premise of this argument. It's basically arguing that if a policy would be good purely in the abstract, then we should like try to implement it even if we're 100% certain it will fail, even if we're 100% certain it'll make things worse. And that's really not how any like common sense real world notion of morality works. For example, we might generally agree with the premise that doctors should help the injured, but if a particular doctor is a dermatologist and the patient's injuries are serious and life-threatening and require a trauma surgeon, and the dermatologist knows that if they try to operate, they're probably going to make the problem worse and maybe kill the patient, well, that all obviously affects the morality of the choice whether to act. So the consequences of an action definitely bear on the moral decision whether to do it. The likely expected consequences bear on the morality of doing it. So if the negative is successfully showing that an attempt to guarantee housing is likely to fail, maybe even causes backlash, maybe causes resentment or whatever, the Aff can't just hand wave that away by saying, well, the resolution says ought, and that means it's a moral debate, and in a moral debate I don't have to worry about consequences. That's just not how anything works in the real world, and as a general matter at LD, you should be prepared to sort of reject that argument. So finally, in terms of our framing and definitions tips, we ask, is the United States the correct actor? And the question here is basically, what do we mean by the United States? So absent some really weird interpretation, the United States normally refers to the country as a whole. Even if we assume that, though, it doesn't explicitly tell us who the actor is, because as a large, complex nation state, there are multiple actors that we could say are acting for the United States. The federal government is the most likely one, but there's also like the 50 states could be doing it independently. You could have like a patchwork of state and local laws. There are a lot of different ways to potentially do something for the United States. I do think that the verb guarantee seems to strongly imply that there has to be an actor of some sort. So if we had a verb like maybe just recognize, I think maybe the Aff could get away with the idea that, well, if the country as a whole just sort of passively accepts a right to housing, then that's enough. But I think a concrete word like guarantee suggests that somebody's going to have to do something. There's going to have to be some affirmative step to make this right real and tangible in some way. And so like we said, the most obvious actor is the federal government, and I think that will be a strong default in most rounds, since that's normally how we make nationwide policy. And overall, I do think that's the way to go if you have to specify an actor. That said, I do think there's some potential criticisms of the federal government taking action here. Most importantly, there's the argument that housing issues vary intensely on a regional and even on a local level. So as we hinted at just a few minutes ago, when we talked about like housing in a place like the Bay Area as opposed to housing in a place like Mississippi, there are dramatic differences in the problems faced in those areas and presumably in the solutions that would be applied. So one criticism that the NEG could raise is that the United States federal government's not the right actor. This is a local issue. It requires local solutions that are different in different places. Honestly, though, I'm not too worried about that as the app. I don't think it's a super strong critique. And that's mainly because if the United States federal government established a right to housing, say in the Constitution or in a federal statute, there's no reason they couldn't implement it differently in different areas. There's no reason they couldn't vary up how they enforce it in different regions of the country. So just for example, when the Supreme Court ordered desegregation of public schools in 1954 under Brown versus Board of Education, the specifics of exactly how to do desegregation were left up to the individual district courts around the country. But that was still guaranteeing a right to integrated schools. And you could very easily do something similar here with a right to housing. You could declare a right to housing and leave it up to like individual litigation or regional authorities or whatever you want to implement it differently, maybe in rural Mississippi as opposed to like in Manhattan or in the Bay Area. So I don't think that does a whole lot for the negative. So with that, let's look at some substantive tips for the two sides, starting with the Aff. So tip number 5 on the Aff is whatever steps we take, establishing the right itself is key. So starting on the Aff side of things, let's talk about a general framing strategy that I think is potentially very strategic and effective, and that is that emphasizing the importance of the guarantee itself, even if nothing else happens. So as we talked about earlier, one key challenge for the Aff is the fact that the details of what a right to housing looks like are still kind of unclear and amorphous in many people's minds. Even definitions as detailed as the UN definition we looked at earlier are long on the list of demands and short on practical answers to like, how is this going to happen? And as we'll talk about later on the neg, that opens up Aff to attack along the lines that this right is basically an illusion, right? Even if Aff isn't reading a very specific plan. And if it's illusory, if it's an illusion, you're basically just making an empty promise, and that's bad for reasons that we'll talk about later. And what I want to suggest is that as the Aff, there's a really strong response to that. Which is basically to argue that even if we assume that the enforcement of a right to housing would be weak or spotty or inconsistent or possibly even non-existent initially, a world where we make the guarantee of housing, where we make the promise, is still inherently better than a world where we don't. The basic argument here is that in the status quo where we don't affirm, we can be pretty confident that not much, if anything, is going to happen to address problems like homelessness or the lack of affordable housing. But in a world where we do literally nothing but have some kind of government-backed promise, even if there's no plan whatsoever to enforce it at the beginning, you're still setting a powerful moral and legal precedent that's going to make it much, much easier to tackle the housing crisis going forward. This is explained by Professor Kristen Davis Adams of Stetson College of Law in a fantastic 2009 piece called Do We Need a Right to Housing? This is an excellent article that sort of systemically works through and answers many arguments on the right to housing, which means it's excellent both for cutting blocks and also for mining for ideas, even for negative arguments. So what Adams says is this: rights, unlike goals, tend to provide the level of specificity needed to motivate follow-through. In addition to having greater power than non-rights, rights create legitimacy for programs to enforce those rights. And she talks about how a right is more likely to stop, for example, budget cuts to things like housing programs. In addition to the power and legitimacy rights bring to bear as a general proposition, rights also have a special role in protecting minority interests against domination by the majority. So in other words, what Adams is saying here is that establishing some kind of right to housing, like through a constitutional amendment to the Irish Constitution like we saw earlier, or just whatever, or through a statute or whatever you want to use, would give individuals legal power to oppose policies that hurt affordable housing and to push for additional greater reforms via things like lawsuits, rather than having to start from scratch and build like grassroots support and win a bunch of elections. And this is extremely valuable in and of itself. Even assuming literally nothing else is done besides the guarantee itself in terms of policy change, because establishing that rights exist shifts the burden from people who want to see something done to the people who want to stop something from being done. And let me give you a historical example that we just mentioned a second ago. Look at Brown versus Board of Education. This is the case that desegregated schools across America, or at least across the South, where they were desegregated back in the 1950s. Now, the plaintiffs in that case who wanted desegregation, they didn't have to sit there and come up with a plausible policy plan. They didn't have to do a nationwide campaign to gin up support. They just pointed to this guaranteed right, which in this case was a right to equal protection in the 5th and 14th Amendments. And they filed a lawsuit saying that equal protection was denied by segregated schools. And the Supreme Court agreed, and it told states that they had to start desegregating their schools with all deliberate speed. Well, 5 years and hundreds of district court orders later, desegregation was basically a reality. It didn't matter that it was a massive, logistically complex undertaking. The fact that the right existed and that somebody filed a lawsuit to enforce it was all that was needed to make it happen. The plaintiffs pushing for this change didn't have to go out and elect a new president or elect an entirely new Congress or even come up with a detailed policy plan, right? They just needed a lawsuit because the right to equal protection had already been guaranteed. So it was really just a matter of going to court to get it enforced. And similarly, in this case, Aff can tell the judge, look, even if we assume that Congress does absolutely nothing to enforce this right, the mere fact that the U.S. makes it a right and guarantees it and writes it down somewhere is going to massively increase the likelihood of affordable housing becoming a reality, just like the guarantee of equal protection massively increased the likelihood and ultimately achieved desegregation, because it gives individuals power through the legal system to demand something from the government, no matter how hard it might be, no matter how much it might cost. In addition to that, there's empirical evidence that declaring a right to housing leads to net progress over time. This is from Catherine Fallon in Housing Matters in 2021. And as you can see here, she talks about how housing advocates are talking about how establishing housing as a right is an important first step and an important precedent to achieving more long-term reforms. She talks about how Scotland demonstrates that this approach had yielded success. And as you can see here, she says Scotland incorporated a commitment to housing as a right into its legislation and its budget in multiple ways. And as you can see over this, what they saw is a long-term reduction in the number of people identified as homeless and increases in benefits provisions. So the basic idea here is we shouldn't make the perfect the enemy of the good. We weren't able to end racial discrimination in a day or a year or a decade after Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We're still fighting that battle today, but it's undeniable that we've made massive progress, largely because we declared non-discrimination and equal opportunity to be a right. And finally, another benefit of emphasizing the value of the promise itself is that this approach helps take out like negative counterplans. And we're going to talk about how counterplans are a really good strategy for the negative on this, because they avoid having to sort of say, well, homeless people are on their own, right? So you're probably going to see a lot of counterplans. But what emphasizing the importance of the right does is, if those counterplans are based on like cost, like a right to housing costs too much, so let's do something else, or really just any disadvantage based on cost, what you can say is that recognizing and guaranteeing the right itself costs next to nothing. It might be as simple as writing this into a statute or writing it into the Constitution. And if that's all that we do, that's still a massive step forward to make it easier to achieve reforms over the long term as opposed to the status quo. So my next point on the Aff is that Rawlsian Justice and marginal utility are really good approaches on the affirmative side. So let's next look to how Aff wants to ground their case philosophically. And in terms of philosophy, especially in more traditional circuits, I think it's going to be hard to beat just good old-fashioned Rawlsian justice. Now, as you probably know, but to very quickly recap, Rawlsian justice says that the only fair way to decide what is just for society as a whole is to imagine ourselves behind this fictional veil of ignorance where we don't know our place in society. For example, we don't know our wealth, our race, our gender, our mental health situation, and so on. And if we did that, Rawls argued, we would systematically prefer options that help the least advantaged first because they have the most to lose in the status quo. For example, homeless people regularly face threats to their lives and their basic safety. And they also have the most to gain from reform. So I I think the benefit of this Rawlsian approach for the app is that it like bypasses a strictly cost-benefit utilitarian approach by arguing that there are really very few things more fundamental than housing. And there are very few people who are more marginalized and more vulnerable than unhoused people, than homeless people. So under a Rawlsian view, unless the right to housing would just absolutely bankrupt the United States to the point it would like somehow cause even more suffering for homeless people, and I don't think that's realistically possible, you basically have a moral obligation to do it, even if it costs a lot, even if there are a lot of downsides to it, because it's necessary for the protection of the least advantaged. There's a good piece on this by Glassman and Carno in 2008 that we'll link to, and it says this, as you can see on the screen. It just says that Rawls' difference principle explains that the only time it's appropriate to be unfair is when the unfairness works in favor of disadvantaged groups of people, and it talks about how some of the most disadvantaged people are homeless youth, so Rawls would have us have a right to housing for them. Another practical way of explaining how Rawls and Rawlsian theories advocate for a right to housing comes from Agnar Sandmo, I think I'm saying that right, in 2015. And while this piece doesn't actually mention Rawls or housing, it nicely explains how like a veil of ignorance framework pretty clearly mandates a housing guarantee. So I'm not going to read all of this, but the basic argument in this quote is very simple. Imagine you have to pick a rule for the society you're about to be born in. Not knowing anything about the situation that you individually will find yourself in, whether you'll be rich or poor or anything else. You have two choices. One is a world where housing is guaranteed, but maybe we can assume that to facilitate that guarantee, taxes will be higher, or the freedom of landlords to evict people, like the freedom of the marketplace, will be restricted in some ways. And then the second option is a world where there is no housing guarantee at all, and if you're unhoused, you're on your own, but maybe taxes are lower or something like that. So the question that Sandmo would ask, and really the question that Rawls would ask, is which one of those would you pick? And the Rawlsian answer is you obviously are going to be picking a world where the right to housing exists because there is no plausible universe where the potential like very speculative upside of like lower taxes or I can do whatever I want if I'm a landlord, there is no world in which that outweighs the risk of being homeless and the very existential like deadly threats that you would face if you were. So ultimately, I think Rawls is just a supernatural fit for this. I think it's a nice, convenient method to pull the debate back from like strict cost and benefits and to say, look, the only fair way to decide what's right and wrong is to take yourself and your position out of it, to pretend you don't know where you would be. If you were about to be born into society, you obviously would want a world where you were guaranteed some basic housing as opposed to like whatever harms my opponent is talking about, like, you know, it's going to be expensive. Well, you wouldn't care. Avoiding homelessness would be all that you would need to know if you didn't know your position and your privilege in society. So next, and finally on the Aff, we have housing is a prerequisite to solving other social ills. So lastly on the Aff, since we have some very strong philosophical ground and some strong literature on like the direct harms of the housing crisis and obviously homelessness, that potentially gives you some room in your Aff case to try to sort of broaden things out a little bit in terms of impacts. And one good way to do that, I think, is to point to the pretty strong links between the housing crisis and problems that at first glance don't seem directly related to the housing crisis, but arguably are. So there's this really good piece from Jacobs and Kula in Business Insider in 2023. It's called "The Housing Shortage is the Root of All America's Problems." And what he says is that Western housing shortages do not just prevent many from ever affording their own home, they also drive inequality, climate change, low productivity growth, obesity, and even falling fertility rates. And as you can see here, we'll pop some of these up on the screen, but yeah, for example, income inequality. Well, you know, when people who are at a lower income early in life can't invest in a resource like a home is your single biggest resource. It's something that your children can inherit worth hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of dollars. When people can't start getting those in a younger generation, that's going to wildly exacerbate wealth inequality, for example, between like my parents' generation and my generation and your generation, right? There's also climate change. And this says that when housing isn't available close to where people work, like when there isn't like sort of denser housing available in cities, what they end up doing is commuting a lot more, right? They have to go live out far out in the suburbs. They spend 2 hours a day in a car driving back and forth. There's no public transit out there in the United States for the most part. So they end up spending a lot more more time in vehicles, idling in traffic, and driving up CO2 emissions. Obesity, here again, spending time in cars, driving, not having walkable cities where housing is close to where things need to be, and even the fertility population decline. This one's pretty obvious, but if you're young and you get married and you can't afford, a house that's big enough for you and your spouse, much less a child, much less multiple children, that's going to have an impact on like how soon you decide to have children, whether you decide to have children, how many children you decide to have. When housing is inadequate, we're going to see problems there. And of course, there is a demographic crisis in the West right now that countries are seeing below replacement level fertility rates, which seems like it might be a good thing if you believe that the world is overcrowded. But over the long run, it means there's like a demographic collapse where you don't have enough people to pay taxes for things like Social Security and other benefits. So it's potentially a real problem. So with that, now let's shift gears and talk about the negative. With point number 8, the negative needs to nail down the AF on what, if anything, specifically they are proposing. There's a lot of reasons why this topic is an uphill battle for the neg, but I think the main one is the idea of guaranteeing a right to housing is just a very hard concept to nail down in practical terms. It's very difficult to predict exactly what the practical contours of this guarantee are, and it's going to change from round to round, from AF case to AF case. At one end of the spectrum, like we said, a right to housing could just be a promise, like a value statement, and that's it. At the other end of the spectrum, it could be this massive policy plan that completely reworks a huge sector of the economy. And in between, there are a lot of other possibilities. And obviously, how you as the negative attack the AF is going to depend almost entirely on where along that spectrum the AF case sits. So you as the neg are going to have at least 2 basic plans of attack. One for affirmative cases that do very little and are basically like sort of imaginary, illusory promises. And the other for AFs that actually do a lot and have a lot of concrete policy steps, but also therefore have a lot of trade-offs and costs associated with them. You might very well even have more specific responses to like particular types of cases, and that's great. But no matter how many different options you have to nail the AF down on exactly what version of a right to housing they are using, because the attacks on the different versions can be essentially polar opposites. Again, one says this is an empty promise, and the other says this is promising too much and there are better options. So the first tip I have for the negative is in cross-examination, you need to be ready to insist that the AF provides significant clarity on exactly what they are proposing. So if I'm the negative and the AF hasn't been perfectly clear, like if they haven't read a specific policy plan, I'm going to start cross-examination by asking very clearly what practical changes happen to U.S. housing policy if we vote for the AF. What exactly are you doing? And if they list things, obviously you start writing those down. And you need to really insist on getting them to commit on the record. Like, so if they list 3 things, you say, okay, you said X, Y, and Z. That's what happens in the AF world. Are there any other things? Okay, so what we're debating in this debate is X, Y, and Z. And then you know what you're fighting with, right? If they don't give any specifics, if they say they just don't know, or if they make some argument that they don't have to give specifics because it's Lincoln Douglas or because the word ought is in the resolution or something like that, again, just get them on the record and be clear. And then I would even say something like, so just to be clear, I am asking you to specify literally anything that's going to happen as a tangible matter. And I'm telling you this is important to my case to have a fair opportunity to refute you. And you're telling me you're just not going to give me any specifics. Just get them on the record with that. And basically, depending on what their answer is, I think there's going to be sort of 2 options. And these are going to be the last 2 tips in the video, but let's lay out what they are really quickly. So if they say, I don't know what the app is going to do, or I don't have to tell you what the app is going to do in terms of like the practical world, we're going to do 2 things. The first is we're going to run a topicality argument that they're not really guaranteeing anything. And the second is we're going to run an argument that even if they are topical, what they're doing is making a completely illusory, imaginary, meaningless promise, and that has negative consequences that are actually worse than doing nothing. And we'll come back to that, but that's the basic plan if they refuse to give specifics. On the other hand, if they give specifics of like the tangible things that are going to happen, then if it were me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a counterplan. And we're going to talk in a second about like what one potential counterplan would be. I might still also run a topicality argument in that case, especially if like what they're proposing is so trivial and ineffective that it doesn't really guarantee a right to housing. But I'm definitely going to run a counterplan if they're going to have a specific policy proposal. Now, as a quick bonus, I'll talk a little bit about the topicality topicality attack that I would make. So I think the topicality attack on an app that runs like a limited advocacy or no specific advocacy, it runs something like this. You base it on two terms in the resolution, right and guarantee. So you remember earlier we said that Aff wants to argue that a guarantee is just a promise, and that's perfectly fine because even if you don't keep the promise has value. Well, the negative wants to argue exactly the opposite. It wants to say that the word right means that you have to have a realistic, plausible, spelled out method of whatever you're guaranteeing. So this comes from law professor Philip Harvey in 2004, and what he says is there is no such thing as an unenforced right. If a so-called human right is not enforced, it isn't a right at all, just a moral claim. This view was famously expressed by Jeremy Bentham, objecting to the rights talk of the French Revolution. Right, the substantive right, is the child of law. From real laws come real rights. But from laws of nature, fancied and invented by poets, rhetoricians, I think I said that right, and dealers in moral and intellectual poisons come imaginary rights. In other words, the word right presupposes a specific legal enforcement mechanism. And if the app doesn't provide one, or if it provides one that's too narrow or limited to actually guarantee housing, it should lose the round on topicality because whatever promise or assurance it's making, even if we think it's morally good, even if it has some nice effects, is not a right in any meaningful sense of that word. It is a wish. It is a hope. It is an aspirational goal. And you can sell the judge on this in common sense terms. We would not say that you have a right to a trial by jury in a country where, say, jury trials only happen very rarely. They only happen when the government happens to be able to find enough jurors, and it usually doesn't. You wouldn't say you have a right to a trial by jury there. We would not say you have a right to education in a country where public schools are basically non-existent. They're in the Constitution, but they don't exist in most places. They only exist in places where the government can scrounge up enough money and only a tiny percentage of the population actually has them. And we can't say that you have a right to housing under an app, or even if you implement it, huge numbers of people are going to remain unhoused because the so-called right depends on a bunch of contingencies, or is very limited, or is just ineffective, or is non-existent, right? In addition, even if a weakly enforced, partly enforced, or unenforced promise of housing were somehow topical under the word right, the resolution goes even farther than that, requiring the AF to offer a guarantee of that right. So Collins' dictionary defines the verb guarantee in the specific context of government action this way. It says, if one thing guarantees another, the first is certain to cause the second to happen. We can prefer this definition over general definitions about like guarantees being promises, first because it looks at the specific context of guarantees by government, which is the only way that you're going to get housing in most cases, and secondly because putting the word guarantee next to the word right, which most people understand to be an enforceable entitlement, the resolution strongly implies that this is something that people can actually count on in practice. And that's really important on a topic about housing, because unlike, say, like if I were to guarantee that the Chiefs will win the Super Bowl, a housing guarantee that falls through at the last minute is not trivial. It's not arbitrary. It can have deadly consequences for people who are expecting to be housed and then weren't. So illusory promises here have real harm. It's not just that that's bad. It's not just that that's undesirable or a disadvantage. It makes them non-topical because the resolution is in two places with right and guarantee, demanding that they provide an assurance, not just an empty promise. So now in the alternative, let's look at what to do if the AF does offer a reasonably impactful plan to address the housing crisis. And this is point number 9 on the negative. Counterplans are your friend. So right off the bat, let me say I think counterplans are by far the best option for the negative on this resolution. It's just very hard on an intuitive level to argue that nothing should be done about homelessness, or that like cost is more important than basic needs, or that homeless people don't deserve housing. Those are just tough things to argue. There are, as we said earlier, some hardcore libertarian philosophical arguments and free market economic arguments, but I think in most rounds with most judges, it's going to be a major uphill battle, and it just kind of runs directly into the teeth of some of the AF's strongest points, and it kind of just feels a little gross and cruel too, so I wouldn't want to have to run those arguments. The most effective common sense counterplan, though, if you're going to run one, I think would be something like a universal basic income or a guaranteed minimum income counterplan, which basically says, yes, we agree that everyone should have their basic needs met, but why box them into housing? Housing is important, but it's just one function of a larger crisis in which people from the very poor all the way up to the working class don't have access to the resources they need. For some people, the chief impact might be housing, but for other people, it might be something else. So why not just give people what they need in the form of a literal check, like literal cash money every month? Now, if you're not familiar, a universal basic income, or UBI, is just that. It's an amount of money that the government pays to every individual on a regular, usually monthly basis with no strings attached, and they can spend it on whatever they need. Guaranteed minimum income, or GMI, is similar but slightly different in that the government pays you the difference between whatever you earn and some decided upon minimum amount. So for example, if we decide that everyone needs $2,000 a month and you earn $1,000, you would get the difference, which would be $1,000. Now, if you want a good summary of how UBI and GMI work, we'll certainly link to some sources on that explain them. But as you're going to see in just a minute, there are very strong arguments that a GMI or a UBI would address housing problems at least as well as a right to housing, but it would also have lots of unique benefits that go well beyond housing. Now, the key to making this counterplan work, as with all counterplans, is to show that a UBI/GMI is in competition with a right to housing. In other words, that you can't do both, or that it's extremely difficult to do both. Obviously, if you can do both at the same time, then it's not a valid, it's not effective counterplan. The most basic way to show that they're in competition is to argue that both of these programs cost massive amounts of money to the point that the United States could not plausibly afford to do both at the same time. So you'd start with an estimate of what it would cost to provide actual affordable housing, like a real right to housing for homeless people and non-homeless people who are priced out of markets. So you could, for example, look to Senator Bernie Sanders' Housing for All proposal, which would guarantee every American, regardless of income, a fundamental right to housing. And the expected cost on that is $2.5 trillion, and we'll link to a source on that. And then you would point out that a nationwide UBI, or guaranteed minimum income, would cost about the same amount of money. So a UBI providing every American $12,000 a year would cost the U.S. government more than $3.1 trillion per year, a sum of about 90% of all the money we currently collect in tax revenue. So we'd, of course, have to raise taxes for either one. So both proposals, both a real tangible right to housing that's actually enforced and a UBI, would basically eat up huge portions of the budget. So you couldn't do both. You'd have to pick one or the other. And the basic argument would be that a UBI/GMI can provide nearly all, if not all, of the benefits of a right to housing, but many, many more unique benefits. So for example, first, a UBI/GMI lets people decide what needs are most important. So for example, if you are a young adult trying to save money, for example, a subsidized apartment, that might be good. But if, say, you have the option of living with your parents or staying with friends or something for a while, just for whatever reason, you lucked into that. Well, in that case, a subsidized apartment doesn't do you as much good. But a check for $1,000 or whatever every month would be fantastic. You could put that toward education, transportation, healthcare, whatever you need. If you're recovering from, say, mental health or addiction issues, maybe you want to put it toward treatment. If you're looking for a better job, maybe you want to put that money toward job skills or education. Whatever the issue, a UBI is going to give you the flexibility to use these resources in a way where you're not locked into one specific right that you may or may not need. Second unique advantage would be that a UBI gives people ownership. Once you receive that UBI/GMI check, that's your money. You can save it, you can invest it, you can put it back for a down payment on a home, you can use it for education, whatever you want. That's different from a government-owned or landlord-owned apartment that you only keep as long as you're in the program, whatever the program is, right? On a related point, a UBI can help you wipe out debt, including things like credit card debt and student debt, which is a major factor in income inequality and things like that. And then lastly, UBI/GMI better protects people from the looming threat of automation. This is from Lori Rootman of the Workforce Institute in 2022, and she basically makes a common sense observation, which is that technology is going to remove a lot of people's jobs. AI, robots, things like that are estimated to eliminate about 73 million jobs in the United States by 2030. That's a major crisis. With this potential looming over workers in today's economy, many people are worried about the future of their current positions. Some may look to continuing education initiatives, but having a UBI creates a safety net for those who would lose their jobs due to technology. So a UBI essentially future-proofs us in a sense that it allows us to protect people from having their jobs go away as a result of automation. A right to housing doesn't solve that. It helps with one issue, but it doesn't help provide them with a general income. you don't have food, healthcare savings, a budget for expenses, things like that. In other words, a right to housing is a band-aid for the coming age of automation, whereas UBI is a durable solution. But in addition to that, there's new evidence that a UBI would actually solve the core problem that right to housing is aimed at, which is homelessness, actually better than a right to housing. So this is from Ryan Dwyer and others in 2023. And what it talks about is studies of direct cash transfers to homeless people and their effectiveness. And I'm not going to go through all the data, but we'll flash some of it up on the screen. But basically what it says is that these things result in actually better outcomes for homeless people than even programs that provide houses. So basically, as you read through this study, you'll find some very compelling evidence that we can address the problem of homelessness just as directly through cash transfers as opposed to right to housing. And finally, we have point number 10 on the negative: empty promises dilute the power of rights. So finally, to generate some offense on the negative side, independent of things like counterplans and topicality, there is the general argument that guaranteeing rights without specific policy protections is basically an empty promise, and that even if it's topical, which we're going to argue it's not, empty promises are still worse than nothing because they create real-world harms. They erode respect for rights in general. So first, we start with the idea that rights are proliferating rapidly and are often meaningless. This is from Zachary Elkins and Tom Ginsburg of the Constitute Project, and it just talks about how the British philosopher Jeremy Bentham once described rights as nonsense upon stilts, by which he meant they were simply invented entitlements without a real foundation. It talks about how there's an idea called rights creep, where we see constitutions guaranteeing more and more rights, with an average of 20 in 1900, with the number now having doubled to over 40. In addition to this general observation, empirically, many of the rights guarantees that we see made are illusory. This is from Emily Hafner Burton and Kiyotaro Tsutsui, I hope I got that right, in 2005. And it just talks about the hypocrisy of recognizing rights among governments in the world. It says governments recognize like these sort of vague international human rights, left, right, and center. We're seeing massive increases in governments signing on to international agreements where they say, oh, we guarantee this right, we recognize that right. But in fact, empirically, there's no increase in the actual protection of the rights that they're talking about, and in many cases, human rights repression is actually going up. So there's a lot of hypocrisy and a lot of empty promises going on as we increase the number of rights in the world. Now, second, the right to housing in particular is unenforceable, and unenforceable rights diminish respect for other rights. So this is from Miraw Firth-Madskin of the University of Chicago in 2019. And the article says, as you can see here, the United Nations has had a right to housing for some time without being able to end the problem of housing in the world. Once we start not meeting one right, we diminish all rights. It's a slippery slope. It's better to have fewer well-established rights that everyone agrees on than rights which the government doesn't have the resources to address. So the basic idea here is that when we talk about rights, it can't just be empty rhetoric. Declaring something a right is a pretty absolute and very important claim. It has a powerful persuasive force in social discourse. Once people agreed, for example, that voting was a fundamental right, it was very hard to stop the movement for women and minorities to be able to vote. Once people agreed that marriage was a fundamental right, it was pretty hard to stop gay Americans, lesbian Americans from being able to gain the right to get married. So what we want to do is save rights guarantees for things that we can actually make good on, because if we don't, it's like the fable of the boy who cried wolf. When we start yelling out that everything is a right, but we don't actually enforce those rights, that they're basically meaningless, or that they're very, very sort of selectively enforced or partially enforced, then the next time that we really want to set something apart as being genuinely important, a genuinely inalienable, non-negotiable entitlement, nobody's going to pay attention and nobody's going to give us any credibility. But when we start applying the term right to things like physical goods that we may or may not be able to guarantee, we cheapen it. We diminish it. We take away the persuasive force it has in the discourse. If everything is a right, then nothing is a right. The term right becomes meaningless. And even worse than eroding respect for rights, as a practical matter, rights to housing have the potential to backfire and make the problem worse. So as we talked about earlier, the article from Stephen Greenhunt in Reason Magazine in 2023 points out that if in the sort of particulars of a right to housing, we go in and start interfering with the free market and saying you have to, for example, not evict people, right? You have to allow anyone who wants to rent this place to rent it, even if it's very clear that they will never be able to pay you. Now, it's hard to nail the Aff Down to that, but if you're able to do that, that would have a devastating effect on the market for new housing developments, because as we said earlier, why in the world would you invest in building a new housing development as a private developer if you knew that there was like a federal right that meant if you didn't get paid, too bad, the person can just live there, you're stuck. That would drive the housing supply down, not up. And basically, more generally, what Greenhunt is saying here is that when legislators actually try to put pen to paper and define what a right to housing would look like, you basically get, in all honesty, gibberish that's more or less meaningless and probably unenforceable. Like, what does it mean in a state with 180,000 people being homeless, like California, to pass a law saying that everyone's entitled to adequate materials, adequate facilities, and cultural adequacy? We don't even know what those words mean. And so that is it. 10 things that I am hopeful will be at least somewhat helpful on the September-October housing topic. Sorry we weren't able to do a full video this time, but I hope some of that was at least useful, maybe to get you ready and get your brain kind of primed to be prepared for things that you might see. Thanks for your patience. Thanks for sticking with us to the end. And as always, best of luck in a new LD debate season, which I personally think, and don't tell the PF folks this, is the best kind of debate in the world. And so with that, we will wrap up by saying what we always say on this channel, which is that debate is for everybody. So work hard, have fun, and hail state.